Hi everyone, welcome to episode number 13 of Perfect Inspiration. My name is Brian Matias. So I'm really excited for this episode because it gave me an opportunity to dig back in my archive back in 2010 to work on an image that I haven't looked at in a long time. When I was on vacation here in Italy for 2 weeks, it was kind of a photo project, but it also was a vacation. So I took this image here in Italy, in Sorrento, and the goal is for this episode to try to give inspiration in terms of creating your own world. Now, for those that may not know where this particular scene is, I've got my Google map loaded here, and the ship that we were living on was actually too large to dock here, so the ship was docked way out in the ocean, and then we took a little tender which docked right here. And then basically to get to the main town of Sorrento, you have to go up this large road called Via Marina Piccola, and I have a street view that shows you. So the shot actually that we're going to be working on today, I was crouched right here, and then if we just turn around, you can actually see the basic scene, which I absolutely love. I love being able to translate pretty much the real world shot, and so if we kind of quickly jump here, you can see what I was talking about. Now, if you're standing here, you kind of know that these walls here tower over you. They're actually pretty massive. And I ended up using a Canon 15mm fisheye lens because I love the way this road curves. It's actually a really large curve. And the fisheye lens is perfect here because it accentuates that curve. It makes it look even larger. It almost looks like a quotation in a way, or a question mark. So what I did was I ended up taking 9 brackets, which you can see in the grid view over here, mostly because if you go back to that original bracket here, you can see that we have a lot of loss of information in this single exposure. And so what I wanted to do was just try to get a nice kind of even exposure. We're going to do something differently here in terms of how we're going to tone map, but I wanted to walk through the brackets first. So here's the darkest bracket that's exposing for the brightest amount of light, and you can see that we've got good information there. And then as we start exposing, we get more details. There is some motion with the traffic, which I'm not worried about, and you'll see why in a minute. But then we start getting shadow detail, so all of the details through here, through the little wrought iron and the foliage, we get that information. Now, normally historically, when I've been working with tone mapping, I would send my brackets to a product called Photomatics and let it do the tone mapping. What we're going to do here is we're still going to send these 9 exposures to Photomatics, except we're just going to use it to save a 32-bit floating point TIFF file. And we're actually going to use Adobe Lightroom 4.1 to do the tone mapping, and then we'll stylize. So I'm going to start by going to File, Plug in Extras, and I'm going to select Export to Photomatics Pro. Now here's the key, is this checkbox right here. That says Show Intermediary 32-bit HDR Image. By default, I believe it's off. And if that's the case, you're going to bypass the ability to save the 32-bit file. So what you'll want to make sure of is that you turn it on. And I'm going to just change my file name here just to something like HDRX32. And I'm going to set it as a 16-bit TIFF, and then I'll hit Export to begin. All right, so you can see here that we've got our image. This is the pre-tone mapped image. And you know, at face value, it may, you might get nervous and wonder why it looks so awful. And that's because we haven't tone mapped yet. We haven't actually converted the image down to a 16-bit display. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to File and then Save As, and I'm going to put this on my desktop. I'm going to change the file format. This is kind of important for Lightroom, to the floating point TIFF file format. And again, here I'm just going to call this Sorrento LRTM for a tone map. And I'm going to save it to the desktop for now and hit Save. You'll just confirm again to save the file, and it saves the image for you. What we're going to do now is we're going to return to Lightroom, and we'll actually start the tone map using Lightroom as opposed to Photomatics or any other product. All right, so now we're back in Lightroom. I already imported that file, and you can see that it is pretty much, it looks like you totally missed your exposure, you're totally overexposed. And you know, at first glance, that again, just like before, that can maybe freak you out. Here's the thing though, you want to go to the Develop module, and what we're doing is we're essentially tone mapping. So you can see if we look at our trusty histogram, there's essentially absolutely no data except for everything that's bunched up in the highlights. They all look clipped. Now what you don't see though is that in that area there's a tremendous amount of data. How do we know that? Well, I'm going to start first by taking the exposure slider and I'm going to drag that way down. Now watch, look at all that data in the histogram and then look at the image. We're actually getting all that really nice information. Look at all that information, all that data that was originally bunched up in the highlight area of the tone. Now, here's where I find a really wonderful and maybe not so understood feature of Lightroom comes into play. What I want to do is I want to achieve the correct points for my highlights, my shadows, and my white and black points. So how do we do that? Well, on a Mac, I'm going to press and hold the Option key, and if you're on a PC, press the Alt key. Now look at this tone over here. When I press the Option or Alt key, it turns to Reset Tone. That means that you are, in fact, pressing the right button. Now, while I'm still holding the Option or Alt key, I'm going to start dragging the highlights. What are we seeing here? Well, we're basically seeing any information that's lost in the highlight area, and it's represented by the white and blue dots. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag the highlights to the left, and I'm going to drag it until I basically see nothing. So you can see as I drag to the left, those dots are disappearing, and now I can let go. And you can see that we've restored that information in the highlights. I'm going to do the same thing for the shadows. With the shadows, I'm going to drag it to the right this time, but I'm not going to spend too much time, and I'll show you why. Watch, if I drag the shadows all the way to the right, you notice how we're not actually losing, or rather we're not getting any more information back. But we are actually kind of bringing out too much of the shadows, so I'm going to bring that back down. Now, here's an important point while I'm doing this. Just because, say, the highlights, this is showing you a good highlight point, doesn't necessarily mean that that's where you should leave it at. This is very much a subjective place for stylization. You might like having a bit more of a hotter highlight, in which case bring those highlights back up. I kind of like having minimal hot highlights, so I'm going to keep it where it was. I'm going to repeat the process with the white point and the black point. So the white point's pretty good. I'm going to bring it down a bit. And the shadow, or rather the black point, I'll bring up just a bit. And so now what you see here is we've got a really good, nice, evenly exposed image. You can see that we don't have that hot point from the original bracket. Everything just looks good. And this is something that in my evolution of working with HDR images, I'm starting to find myself appreciating more of the natural look of the tone mapped image. That's not to say that the stylization, which we'll do next, won't go more carried away. But when I start with my baseline, I like to have this nice evenly exposed image. And actually Lightroom worked like a champ here. And ultimately the proof really is in the pudding with the histogram. You can see all this beautiful data that's spread across the entire tonal range of the scene. So for now what I'm going to do is, actually before we stylize, I did this in advance, but I want to show you something. Let's compare stylization with Lightroom, not stylization rather, but tone mapping with Lightroom versus Photomatics. I'm going to take that image that we just tone mapped and I'm going to drag it over to this folder here called PMX for Photomatics. And we're going to compare the two. So the image on the left is tone mapped with Photomatics, and the image on the right is tone mapped with Lightroom. So you see the difference between the two? Let's actually go ahead. I'm going to tab out so we have nothing, and I'm going to highlight both of these and put them into compare mode. So you can see the differences here. Photomatics does more of a I guess depending on how you want to look at it, a good job of bringing out the shadow details. You can see over here the shadows are brought out more, but it also kind of has a little bit of a muddy feel, especially in the highlights. In the highlights, when you look at it from a zoomed out view, this just kind of looks a little muddy. And it almost looks like that it has a bit of chromatic aberration around the high contrast edges. But, to each their own. For the longest time, I was a huge fan of this, and I still am to a degree. There have been a few instances already where I tried tone mapping with Lightroom and I wasn't necessarily happy with the results. So I would go and I would tone map with Photomatics. But the key here is if you have Adobe Lightroom 4.1, one of the features that they included is this ability to handle these 32-bit tone mapped image or 32-bit images to tone map. So it really is a nice little feature. And I do like, I mean, everything just looks realistic and natural compared to this version here in Photomatics. So we're going to stick with that. I'm going to go ahead and go out of the lights out mode and out of the compare mode. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to send this over to the Perfect Photo Suite so that we can stylize it. And this is the whole crux of this week's episode is I took this world here, this world in Sorrento, you know, it's already fantastical, but I'm going to change it up to suit my own sense of style and imagination. So I'm going to go to File, Plug in Extras, and then select the Perfect Photo Suite. All right, so now we've got the image in perfect layers, and I'm just going to jump right into perfect effects because that's where pretty much the heavy lifting is going to be done in terms of stylization. So I'll select effects from the module selector and we'll get going. All right, so now we're in perfect effects, and if there's one question that I get asked more than any other, it's, you know, Brian, how do you know what you're doing to your image? You know, how do you know what works and what doesn't work? And the answer usually, depending on who the person is, it can be kind of deflating. But the truth of the matter is that the effects that I apply, that comes from years of just playing around. Before Perfect Effects existed, we had Photo Tools 2.6 and 2.5, and I use those products every single day. So when we translated and ported the effects from Photo Tools to Perfect Effects, you know, I kind of, it's all experiential. It's all, you know, trying things out, seeing what works and what doesn't work. So for a scene like this, I knew right off the bat, I mean instantly, that the first effect I'm going to apply is one that I've used pretty often. It's under the movie looks category, and it's called Thermopylae. Now Thermopylae gives me the kind of base that I want to add. The first thing I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to change my blending options. Under the Advanced tab here, there's a button called Blending Options. And what this allows me to do is change the way that Thermopylae effect blends with the original layer. So I'm going to go and drop my blending modes. I'm going to preview until I get to Hard Light. Now with Hard Light done, I especially love what it's doing to the background. I'm going to bring that strength down to 0, and I'm going to bring it up slowly until I get it to a kind of a strength that I'm happy with, nothing that's kind of too overpowering. So something around 64, 65% gives me the base. I'll hit apply to commit that. And now in the video here, I'm actually going to speed this up. I'm going to take my masking brush. I'm going to bring up the inspector, make sure I'm set to paint out, and I'm going to remove that Thermopylae effect from the entire road because I'm going to treat the road separately. For those that follow how I stylize, I break down my scene into different elements and I stylize accordingly. So the first element will be the entire, these walls and this pavement. Second element will be the cobblestone road. And the third element will be the vines, the foliage that's kind of hanging. So let me start masking. I'm going to speed this up so you don't have to stare at me masking, and then we'll continue on. All right, that was fun. Okay, so you can see that I, you know, I take masking very seriously, especially when this road it plays such a dominant role. I want to make sure that the mask, when I apply an effect to it, is really clean. So I'm going to go ahead now. I'm going to hit Add, and that's going to save that Thermopylae effect and create a new effect layer. And so now it's time to tackle the road. I'm going to start by going to the Movie Looks category, and I'm going to apply an effect here, one of my favorites, called Blue Dawn. When it comes in and applies, it applies to the whole image. Now I really only want it to apply to the road, so watch what I can do. I'm going to go back to that Thermopylae effect. I'm going to go to the Masking menu and select Copy Mask. With that done, I'm going to go to the Blue Dawn effect, go to Masking, Paste Mask, which pastes it everywhere but the road. And then to flip it, I just go to Masking and Invert Mask, and now I've got Blue Dawn applied only to the road. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to change the blending options because I don't want the normal blending mode. Just like Thermopylae, I'm going to cycle through and go to Soft Light. And I love what Soft Light does to give the road its own kind of characteristic. And you can see how my own personal world of Sorrento is starting to form. So now I'm going to hit Apply, hit Add, and we're going to continue on. So to overall bring this up to a much brighter level, I'm going to apply an effect here called Havana. And you can see it's going to give it a very punchy feel. I'm going to start by bringing the effect down to 0, and then I'm going to bring it up slowly. Probably about, it's too much, maybe 29, 30. That's good. What I also typically do is I do like to change the blending options. I at least like to see. So I'm going to cycle through here, and I think something like hard light might actually work, and I do love what hard light's doing to the background here. I'm going to hit apply, except I don't like how dark this tree has become. So I'm going to take my masking brush. Let me bring up the brush size, make sure I'm set to paint out, and I'm just going to remove the Havana effect from the tree. You can see that it doesn't really matter. I'm not being especially careful with the mask because it's just this general vicinity here that I want to mask out. So with that done, I'm going to hit add and we'll continue onward. I mentioned how the foliage and the vines, that plays its own role. Now I get criticized for this effect a lot. It's under photo filters and it's called green enhancer. And I get criticized for it because apparently I punch it up too much. Now that's okay, because one, I really can't see greens very well. I can kind of see this shade of green, but being red-green colorblind, it's hard for me to kind of tell the subtleties and nuances of green. Still, ultimately, you stylize to your own taste. Forget about what anyone else thinks. Just do what looks good to you. So for me, this is too much. I'm going to go ahead and bring it down to 0 because it just looks too bright. I'm going to bring it up probably about 33, that's fine, 33%. And I really only want to localize the green enhancer to this area here. So I'm going to take my masking brush and I'm going to hit this invert button. And what that does is it flips the mask. So it hides the entire effect and it puts my brush into paint in mode. So now watch, I can kind of start painting that green enhancer exactly where I want it. I'll just kind of paint it through the tree and just through these various areas here where we've got leaves. So that they can actually enhance it, and a little bit over here too. Actually right up there. All right, so I've got the green enhancer, and I'm not done yet. I'm almost done. I'm going to go to the color and tone category. This is an effect that goes on almost every single image of mine, and it's called tonal contrast. And what it does is it adds a nice kind of grit to the image, some texture bite. Bring the strength down to 0, and you can see I do this with every effect. I bring it to 0 and I bring it up kind of independently of each other. And so I like what this does to the overall image here. Hit add, and now I'm going to add one last effect under the glow category. I'm going to add the Hollywood glow. Now you can see at 100% in a normal blending mode it's a bit much. I'm going to bring the blending options up, and I'm going to cycle over, and I usually like how soft light blending modes work with glows, except I'm going to bring it to 0 and just kind of bring it up. I only want a touch, so something about 24, maybe a little bit more. That's looking good. Hit apply. I'm going to bring up the masking brush and bring down the brush opacity. So this is dropping the strength of how much of the effect is being removed. I'm just going to do one quick stroke through the tree because the tree got, again, a bit too dark. So now watch, I'm going to click right down here. You see where my cursor is on the bottom right? The square will hide the effect bar. I'm going to close the inspector and let's just take a look at our before and after. You can toggle the before and after by hitting Command P on a Mac or Control P on a PC. So you can see, whoa, that was our original image. This is our after image. And to me, this is what Sorrento reminds me of. I've become really good at kind of taking what I remember of a scene and translating it into some sort of stylization. It's what I love to do. It's what I look forward to doing most when I work on images. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hit apply and I'm going to hit save to return back to Lightroom so we can finish things off. All right, so we're back in Lightroom and I'm in the develop module here with the image that we just stylized. I'm not going to do too much. I know that the overall tone of the image is good. I'm going to bring out some contrast though to make it pop. And then I'm also going to add a little bit of clarity, which will add some more bite to the image. I'm also going to usually I'll boost the vibrance, but I'll also drop the saturation in kind of even amounts because the color is getting too punchy for me. I really like what vibrance does in terms of punching the right amount of color, whereas saturation will just kind of bring out the color of the entire image as a whole. The last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to just scroll to the bottom and add a slight post-crop vignette. Nothing too heavy, but just something to burn the edges and bring your eye further to this curve. So I'm going to bring that midpoint down, and because I have a lot of highlights, especially on the top here, I'm going to jack up the highlight slider, which preserves the highlight information through the vignette. That was a common complaint when you would add a vignette after crop, especially through a highlight, is that you kind of muddy up your highlights. By increasing the highlight slider, you're actually preserving that highlight information. And so here we have the image that, when I think of Sorrento, I think of something like this, like something kind of fantastical, like The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings type of scene. And so when you're out shooting, maybe you're on vacation this summer, and you get the shots that you want, don't be confined to what the scene looked like. Remember that you've got some amazing tools that can help you remember the time that you were there the way you want to, and convey it to everyone the way that you feel it should be conveyed. So thank you very much. Be sure to download the Perfect Effects preset that I saved that I use for this image, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you very much.